everyone. That was fantastic, wasn't it? Please don't fall asleep during this session. I was very, very relaxed there. It was beautiful. Actually, it's probably a good way to start thinking about money and funding, isn't it? Because it's quite a challenge a lot of the time. So, next 20-25 minutes or so, I'm going to talk to you about funding and budgets. And I've just called it the knowns and the known unknowns. And for any of you that are historians, I do know that was a saying that I think it was Donald Rumsfeld, who I think he was a foreign secretary, American foreign secretary back in the 70s. But it works really well for a lot of what we need to talk about in funding and budget setting. I think so. We're going to talk about some things that we know, and equally the known unknowns, because they're the bits that really put you to work when you're setting budgets, making assumptions, deciding on different scenarios and that sort of thing. So we'll talk a little bit at the end about some strategies, not necessarily for you because you're past masters at this, but when you're in those stakeholder group meetings and you are with a group of decision makers who may not all be, everybody's got a slightly different agenda, haven't they? And that's fine. So it's how do you get those conversations started to make sure that we can set sensible assumptions. Easy. I'm so relaxed now. I'm slurring already. Okay, so to start with thinking about funding and thinking about the current funding year. Now I know your budgets will all be signed off. You're at the beginning of that funding year across your trusts. But I also think that there's quite a lot of different income streams flying around at the moment. So I just thought it would be worth spending a few minutes, and of course they're really welcome. I mean, I'm not saying we don't want those. I thought it would be worth just ironing out which of those income streams we can sensibly, or we know are going to be there for good, or they're going to be subsumed into the National Funding Formula allocations, and which of those other grants, well, the government tends to call them time-limited grants, so they're the slightly riskier ones. And I think sometimes there can be some grey areas. I also think that a lot of what I'm going to say is probably going to be affirmation, because you will know some of these things already, but if it gives you some reassurance, then I'll be pleased with that. So if you're thinking about revenue funding for 23-24, let's start by thinking about the core schools budget. The core schools budget is over 57.5 billion, I think, this year, 23-24, and it's almost going to be almost 4 billion more than it was in the previous year. And they're huge numbers, I think, aren't they? So worth bearing in mind what the core schools budget actually has to feed, if you like. So it's responsible for all mainstream schools 5 to 16. It's responsible for high needs for children and young people from birth to the age of 25. It also includes the pupil premium grant and some of these other time-limited grants that we'll talk about, and also some of these other grants that are going to be baselined, as it says on the screen there. So it's got a big job to do for all of its money, and I think sometimes it's just worth remembering that whilst it sounds like a huge number, we've got to do a lot with it. So why is it 4 billion more than it was going to be than it was last year, I should say? So well, the spending review of 2 or 3 years ago already set in train that we would get an additional 1.5 billion. Then we had the autumn statement last year when the Treasury afforded us an additional £2 billion, which is for this year and is safe for next year. So that's baseline too. And then more recently, we've had the Teachers Paid Additional Grant. Some of these acronyms are fabulous, aren't they? I mean, MSAG, TPAG. We need to. I think we should give them children's names. I think it might be more interesting. But anyway, so an extra £500 million in this financial year for the TPAG. So that takes it up to nearly 4 billion over and above what it was last year. So in terms of what's going to be baselined, that's where we are really. So we've got your national funding formula, we've got your mainstream schools additional grant, which you're getting outside of your NFF allocation this year, but next year we expect that will be baseline, that will slip into there and that will become part of your NFF allocation. And then we've got the Teachers Pay Additional Grant, the TPAG, which is another new one, which you will be getting probably around October, November. You'll get the tranche into your budgets for this financial year. A little bit more about that in a few slides' time. But the important thing to remember is that once these are locked in to the core schools budget, they are baked in, which is a good thing because it means we can't lose them. So they're safe, effectively. The only reason that both of those aren't already in the national funding allocation is because of the timing of them. Simply, they were declared too late for the DFE funding policy unit to get them in the NFF. That's the only reason. So they're all safe, banked, if you like. And then there are the additional grants. So these are what the government tend to refer to as time-limited grants. And they're more risky because we may get used to them, and in your planning you will be wanting to include them for the period of time that you know they are safe. And then you will probably want to scenario plan, because we know that government sometimes changes their mind, and we will always be, organisations like mine will always be lobbying to keep these and move them over here, from over there to over here, to get them baseline. Three in particular that you will notice they're all COVID pandemic related, and all of those three as it stands are going to finish at the end of this academic year. These grants tend to go by academic year rather than financial year, which is a bit of a pain as well. As it stands, recovery premium, NCP, 16 to 19 tuition fund, all will roll off. So in terms of your budget planning, yes, you'll have them in this year, but in year 2 of your 3-year budget forecast, you may have looked at a scenario without them, and you might want to think, well, what if? And just keep that one in your desk drawer, probably. Recovery premium, I haven't heard any rumours that that's going to continue. The National Tutoring Programme is something, as a project, is something that we know government are very keen on. So whilst everything that we read tells us that the funding for that will finish at the end of 23-24, there is talk about that. So we need to watch this space on that one, because we know that the tutoring programme is something that, to say, the government are keen on and want to see that continue in schools. What, of course, our job is to say, okay, so that's fine. If you're going to continue that, then we need to see some additional funding for that. Quick reminder, your National Tutoring Programme year-end statement is due at the end of this month. Everybody got it, 29th of September. And you can't say you've used recovery premium to sub it, because that's not allowed this year. 16 to 19 tuition fund, similarly, for those of you that have got sixth form or any 16 to 19 academies, that is likely to roll out at the end of this year. So that's where we are for 23-24. The only grant I want to spend any more time talking about for this year is the Teachers Pay Additional grant. There's a lot of information on here. I'm not going to go through all of it. You'll get slides, so this is just a bit of information overload if I talk all about it now. Well, I thought I would just refer to what the Teachers Pay grant was intended to do and how it ended up at the amount that it did. You will recall that there was lots and lots of conversation about, the Teachers Pay Award. Firstly, what was it going to be? But alongside all that, it needed to be fully funded. And organisations such as ASCL and others, as you will be aware, were heavily involved in the debates about that, as were a lot of the members in balloting, etc. And very quickly, what the government said was, okay, so yes, we're going to say this is fully funded now, because by our costing, schools can afford a 3% pay award, and the Teachers Pay Additional grant, in terms of proportion of core schools budget, is another 3.5%. So there we can say it's fully funded. Okay, and that's one way of looking at it. There are lots of other arguments around that, debates around that, like using averages, that sort of thing. Well, that's a little bit dangerous, but that's how we've got at the amounts that we've got for the Teachers Pay Additional grant. From your perspective in trust, just always remind people that the grant that you're going to get in October or November is only for the period until March next year. It's only for 7/12 of the year. And then the Teachers Pay Additional grant for the following year will be for they've had to put the amount in for the full 12 months. A little bit more about rates and things in a moment. Eligibility, not going to go into that. Any trusts with special schools in there? Yes, okay. So I will make sure I refer to special. Is it all special, or have you got special school?
We've got 2 secondaries and 2
two specials, right, okay. Can you see me then? Would it be better if I went out
I can see you.
Sure? Sorry, not me, the screen.
That's fine, thank you.
So this is important, particularly important for you, because for mainstream schools, you will, particularly in the academy sector, you will get all your money direct to you from ESFA, as you would expect. The special and alternative provision will get your TPAG grant from the local authority. Local authorities are required to pass on 100% of the grant, but there is some flexibility. So if you haven't heard from them yet about how they are going to distribute it, it might be worth asking the question. They must pass it all on, and they must do it within this financial year. They've got to get their act together. They know how much they're going to get now, so they need to be thinking about how they're going to distribute it. And that's important for you to perhaps nag a little bit if they haven't told you already, because you need to know what it means for you. There's also an element built into that 525 million for early years and 16 to 19. But that's going to be distributed really quite separately. So we think that in terms of early years, it's going through the supplementary grant. Anybody got nurseries? Okay, so you will probably have be looking at the supplementary grant stuff. That's just going via local authorities at the moment for the early years. And for 16 to 19, that has been reflected. The additional money for the TPAG has been reflected in an increase in the learner rate. So you're probably getting revised budget statements, programme funding statements about now, and that will show what your revised allocation will be for this academic year. You won't see that come through in the payments probably till October, so don't worry if you get the first payment that doesn't look like it's reflected the uplift. That'll set itself right. It's just a timing thing, that's all. Okay. Funding rates, we don't need to talk about those. Just to say, as far as you're concerned, in the trust sector from April 2024, you will get another tranche to take you up to August. Okay, so you will not be disadvantaged in any way. It never really works to disadvantage you, so just be confident in that. And if you're looking to project rates for next year, remember these are the 7/12 rates. So if you're looking to project rates for budget planning, they'll be 12/7 effectively. Okay, so moving on to 24 to 25. We now know what the indicative allocations look like. Have you all had a chance to look at what your indicative allocation is going to be for 24-25? So you can start to think about tweaking your budget forecasts for year 2. We know that the mainstream schools additional grant is going to be rolled in. We know that that's going to be added to the baseline before the factors in the national funding formula uplifted. So that's a positive thing. Okay. Core factors increase, so that's your basic entitlement funding, disadvantage, and schools, the lump sum. This is really disappointing, I think, but that's the way it is. Free school meal uplift by 1.6%, and that's because of the inflation rate that government use. But it's we've had a lot of feedback to say people are very disappointed in that because it's not going to reflect the cost. Similarly, minimum per pupil funding levels are uplifted, but be mindful that in order to trigger that, the calculation looks at all your core factors. It looks at most school-led factors, and then tests the minimum per pupil funding level. Okay. Funding floor 0.5%. So that means that every school will achieve at least an additional 0.5% on the previous year. That's after baselining. Indicative allocations are there at the moment, but because of local flexibilities that continue, of course, local flexibilities and pupil numbers information, what you get next year, of course, won't end up exactly as they are in the indicative rates. So they will be updated quite rightly to reflect October census. And then there's a couple of issues around local flexibility. So in next funding year, so from September for September 2024, The local authority are still able to move money between blocks in the same way they have been, and nothing's changed there really. And there's still some wriggle room if you're in your local area, the national funding formula isn't already reflected. So there's a little bit of wriggle room there too. Okay, so that's the sort of headlines of what we know about 24-25 for revenue funding. For the high needs block, which will impact on all of you, as you know, the funding floor has been set at 3%, so from a local authority perspective, every local authority is getting at least 3% in cash terms above what they would have got this year. Commission-based funding remains the same, which I think again is quite disappointing because it's been like that for, I think it's 2013, I think it's a long time anyway. Top-up continues to be determined locally. Additional funding for special schools. So this is effectively the mainstream schools additional grant, even though it's rolled in for mainstream, will still comes as an additional grant for you guys. So it's just worth knowing. Particular challenges, I think, for high needs, the SEND improvement plan, which is welcome and has some really, really laudable aims, and certainly we would support that, the aims of it, but we feel it's lacking a costed implementation plan. So, things like the notional SEN budget and how that works, and you providing in mainstream the first 6,000, and have you actually got sufficient resources because of how your NFF allocation works, all those sorts of things we still think are a bit of a challenge, more than a bit of a challenge. And there's an increasing issue. We're getting feedback from our members saying, funding is just not reaching the front line. And what they're talking about there are things like the safety valve programme, if your local authority is in the safety valve programme. Again, laudable aim. It's intended to support those with significant deficits, and the delivering better value SEND, which is sort of like the next run down. So if you're aware that your authority is involved, particularly in the safety valve, that will most likely have implications for your block transfers for the next few years, because quite often those agreements are set in the safety valve programme. So when you're looking at local flexibility, but and indicative amounts versus actual into your bank account, that's going to probably play a part for quite some time. And it's worth asking those questions and really getting to the bottom of that in your local area. Okay, right, so second section, so any questions on that? I mean, there's a lot of information and it's a lot of factual stuff which hopefully will be useful. Any questions? Okay. So with the information that you've got, the known knowns, and clearly there's still quite a little bit we don't know there, particularly around those time-limited grants. We don't know what the rates for pupil premium grant are going to be, for example. It's going to carry on, but we don't know what those rates are. So how do you go about managing that, and how do you avoid being put under unnecessary pressure to try and make those decisions when you can only use the best information that you've got available to you? So these are what I would call the rules of engagement in terms of budget planning. And I'm not professing to tell you anything you don't know here. I'm just trying to sort of simplify it, if you like, as an approach, because some of these conversations get quite heated, don't they? And they can be quite tricky. So the rules of engagement. You can only ever use the best information available to you at the time. So if somebody's asking you to plan a budget for 3 years hence, you know very little about it, you just can't do it. You can only use the best information available to you at the time. But to do that, you will have to top it up with assumptions. Make sure you're not making those assumptions on your own. Budget planning is a team sport, and those two particularly work well together. There is very, very unlikely to be one person across the trust that has all the information that you would need to the depth that you would need it to be able to properly make a set of assumptions that are going to utilise the best information you've got available at the time and give you the best options appraisals, because you've got to think about the curriculum, you've got to think what's changing now, you've got to think about the exam system, you've got to think about, the money, what's coming in, what's ending, all of those sorts of things make it absolutely sensible that this is a team game and you need everybody in the room to provide a level of data that they can summarise and understand at a higher level, so it's an effective decision-making space. Affordability and real life. So these are just some of the conversations that we are having with DFE colleagues quite a lot, actually, to try and help them understand why we're sort of back to the national averages conversation in a way, and the issues that trusts and individual schools have that make affordability a challenge when the headline says these things are fully funded and schools can afford this. Forget hardship fund for a moment, I'll come back to that. So distribution, this is about historic distribution. National funding fund is a work in process, isn't it? The level of centralisation across the trust will have an impact, won't it? Because it will ease potentially some of those pressures for schools in different local authorities, but trusts are in very different places on that. Cohort characteristics is an obvious one. Workforce profile, the sort of the elephant in the room around support self-pay award, which is not agreed yet, as far as I'm aware. Was the last time I looked, and we have never yet received specific grant funding to support them to get that. And in different schools, different workforce profile has significant impact. Reserves plays a part in this. Strategic commitment is about when you've made decisions to follow an objective and picked a direction of travel. Sometimes it's just not that easy to row back on some of those decisions that have been made and commitments that have been made in terms of perhaps investment in a project or IT infrastructure or something, and that then impacts when other stuff happens. The hardship fund, you'll be familiar with the announcement of the hardship fund. It came out at the same time as the announcement about teachers' pay additional grant. It is merely an expansion of the pot of money that ESFA and local authorities have already to help trusts or maintain schools that are in financial difficulty. It's not going to be a silver bullet at all. So I think we just need to keep real about that. Okay, and oh yes. What do we know about the funding for RAC? So what we know is the government have said they will meet the capital costs of mitigations, and they have said that it's only here that is dealing with a school that's got RAC in it. You may or may not want to say in any case. Okay. For any schools that have got that, they should have a caseworker. And what we're hearing now is that the process is being solidified, if you like, which is a good thing. So that every school that has RAC will get a caseworker. It's the caseworker that schools need to start talking to now about costs, particularly those revenue costs that are associated to the problem, but don't come under the capital banner. And Andy and I were talking about this earlier. You'll see lots of sound bites of DFE saying we expect all reasonable revenue costs to be covered. And as my colleague said the other day, that word reasonable is doing a heck of a lot of the heavy lifting on this. We just don't know enough about what it means yet. It seems quite likely, and this is just my supposition, that we're going to be in a similar sort of situation to the COVID emergency funding. So there will be consideration of a school's financial position, trust financial position, level of reserves, etc. But we just don't know yet. And then the broader picture about, okay, so if we're covering capital costs of mitigation, including temporary structures, that's great. But these buildings have got to be repaired or rebuilt to get rid of the RAC. And that could have, as it stands, we need to avoid that having an implication for the rest of you, because at the moment there isn't any new money for this. So capital pot has got to be expanded either from other projects within DFE that they're going to think, okay, so we're not doing that now, so we've got to divert money, or access to capital if you're not subject to, if you're not a responsible body, not under a schools condition allowance. If you're looking for SIV, that pot of money is going to have to cover possibly an even broader range of projects. And I know I was speaking to one of our school leaders a couple of days ago saying they're really worried because they've got significant issues around other areas of compliance like fire, doors, etc. And they're worried that they will be pushed back in the queue for getting SIV money for that. So we need Treasury to put some more money in so that we can make the government can make DfE can make sensible decisions about what happens longer term. Autumn statement coming up, so it's an ideal situation for people like us to lobby. Okay, so I think this is just about me done now. Oh no, there's one more after this, if that's okay. Am I okay? Because okay, thanks. These are conversations that I think you need to keep on the go, plates to keep spinning, if you like, when you're in those decision-making meetings, strategic decision-making meetings, because they're all things that aren't going to go away, but we may not have an absolute answer now. I put budget forecast return in there. That's more for me, really, to prompt me to ask you a question, if I may. How do you feel about the extension submission date to the 31st of August? Was it helpful? Was it? No. I think most people are.
The board had already met before the end of term.
Yeah.
And the board weren't going to meet in August.
No.
So it didn't really achieve a lot.
No. Okay.
It's helpful from an admin side.
Okay.
It bought you more time to do it, but in terms of the decision making, it wouldn't have made any difference.
Yeah. I think it's going to be like that now, isn't it? But I mean, I think the question, and I think those two things will always play a part in it, won't it? Because even now we know that it's going to be at the end of August. Do you want the board to meet over the summer? What's the chances of that happening? Anyway, interesting. Thank you for that. So other conversations that we need to keep having. So structural funding issues. By that I mean these local flexibilities. And by the way, this is not me being critical of the local authorities at all. They are also incredibly strapped for cash most of them. It's just the way the structure is playing out. So while they're having to make decisions about moving money between blocks, that makes predictability really quite difficult, doesn't it? And we're supposed to be getting this direct national funding formula, and yet those structural funding issues are likely to continue because local flexibility is built into proposals for the direct national funding formula. Energy contract stability is again, that's something that's ongoing. It's causing different people different levels of issue. National Joint Council and the minimum wage. This is clearly about support staff pay, but because of the way that the minimum wage is working as well, the Low Pay Commission are predicting that there's going to be quite a lot of debate, disagreement probably going forward. So we're probably going to see quite a lot of volatility around those things. Runoff recovery funding we talked about. We're coming to the end. 24-25 will be the last year of this spending review period. We know very little about what's going to happen post 25. The Chancellor did say at one point that you could expect public sector budgets to increase by no more than 1%. I actually wouldn't take too much notice of that because I think it's too far in the distance and too much has happened, and those sort of predictions are not particularly helpful. I don't think we need to wait to see where we are at the time. Pension scheme LGPS has been re-evaluated this year, so you're into that now, aren't you, from 2023? Is that right? Yeah. And again, that's quite a varied picture from our membership. Certainly, we're picking up varied impacts. Inflation measures rumbling on, and the impact on schools. I mean, it's really about debate about how do you measure school costs, what measure of inflation do you follow? Does government follow a GDP deflator, which tends to be lower than CPI? Pupil numbers. So this is an important one because we know that nationally the pupil population is declining over time. We need to keep that conversation really at the forefront of developments of the funding formula, because as it stands, we are very concerned that there's a risk that the management of those falling roles is going to fall on the schools sector, the provider sector, because whilst it's the distribution methodology is pupil-led, quite simply, less pupils, less money. But you are going to have to manage that. We think, because the national funding formula is taking so long to get towards its endpoint, to its direct national funding formula, that we think we should use some of this time at least to consider the implications of that. So that's something I think that we need to be thinking about a lot. This is definitely me done for this. So yeah, just 3 questions that might help thinking about, what I was saying about getting these conversations started from your perspective, but needing to include everyone from all aspects of school life or education provision. I think they're just quite handy starters. So, what are the outcomes that were most important for strategic success? That's your direction of travel as a trust. So once you've all agreed those, how are we going to distribute the resources that we've got? That would be people and money. And the last one really is just about options appraisal, isn't it? So you need a set of success criteria, and you will all have a separate set of success criteria, but at the very least it's going to be a sustainable curriculum, sufficient and necessary support staff, sufficient and necessary curriculum resource, buildings that are safe and warm. That's really come into focus in the very recent past, and sustainability from a net zero perspective is something that people are now quite rightly considering as absolute success criteria. So the question is, when you've made these decisions, different scenarios, how do you test them against that set of success criteria and see how they play out? And then everyone is very clear on why you've chosen a particular route, and then review it as more information becomes available. Okay, I think apologies for going over time a little bit, but are there any questions or anything that I haven't covered that you would like to ask about?
I've got a question. You sort of touched on a teacher pension increase. So we've sort of heard from, I guess, a few presentations by actuaries and things of potential increase in the teacher pension contribution rate, the employer and the employee, which I think will, from my understanding, will take effect from 1st September 24. Likely to be quite a sizable increase, potentially.
There's I'm not a pensions expert by any means. There's conversation about how it interacts with the scape rate as well, I think, which I know even less about.
Yeah.
But
so I've heard one actuary say that potentially a 20 to 30% increase in the employer contribution rate.
Gosh,
yeah. So it's currently 23.68. So take it up to
nearly 30.
28, 29, 30. I haven't heard anything about any additional funding, because obviously last time there was a large increase, there was that additional teacher pension grant. Have you heard anything at all in terms of potential additional funding for that increase? We've definitely had conversations as part of our sort of stakeholder groups with the funding policy team, and I think their view is that it would have to come from Treasury, and that historically that has happened, and it tends to affect other public sector pensions at the same time, and therefore, I can't say there will be money, but let's just say I'm not losing sleep over it. No.
I think there will
that's what
be
logically.
Yeah.
I thought, but sometimes logic.
Yeah. Well, no, I know, and who knows? And that's why I say I can't. With my ASCL hat on, I can't say anything because it's not an official.
Yeah.
But the conversations that we've had, seem to indicate that that could not be managed as a cost pressure.
No, exactly. Yeah.
So I think.
Great. No, thanks, Julia. That's great.
Thank you very much. Thanks.